Welcome to Beginner Fly Tying, the series where I'll walk you through some foundational trout flies. It's designed to be a true introduction with a focus on techniques while tying patterns that catch fish. Take your time with these videos and re-watch them as you practice. Remember not to rush through steps, even if they feel obvious. Today we're tying the Walt's worm in 3 different styles. It's an unassuming pattern, but it catches many fish. The fly imitates grubs, crane fly larvae, caddis, and other aquatic nymphs. Depending on how you tie it, it can be fished in different parts of the water column to mimic these bugs. We'll start with the classic, created by Walt. You can tie it on any size or shaped hook, but today I'll be using a size 12, 3x long streamer hook, which will match closer to a crane fly larva. The original calls for hare's ear, and I'll be doing the same, but any dubbing that's buggy and consists of several colors, textures, and lengths of fibers will work well. Secure your hook in your vise. We'll start with lead-free wire, which will help the fly sink. I'm using 0.02 diameter wire, but use what you have. Snip or tear off a piece about 6 inches long. The wire is soft, so you can probably tear yours by hand. Remember to pull off more than you need, as you can always use leftover wire for another fly. Start taking wraps with your wire, holding one end in place with your non-tying hand. If the wire wraps start to drift, you can pause and push them back together. Once you run out of material, make sure you tuck that tag end against the hook shank with either a blunt tool or your fingernail. Any wire ends poking out may catch and tear your tying thread. Then take some more wraps with the remaining end so that about half the shank is covered. I ended up taking about 15 wraps for this hook and this gauge wire. You can use more or less wire depending on how quickly you want your fly to sink. Just avoid creeping up more than a couple eye lengths behind the eye of the hook. Tear or snip off any excess, and again, tuck down that cut end of wire and smush it together from both ends. If your wire wraps drifted too far forwards or backwards, now is the time to shimmy them into place. Again, don't crowd that eye. I leave at least a full eye's length, if not 2. Secure your tying thread in front of the wire with a few wraps, making sure to wrap over your tag end. With light tension on your thread, take wraps over your thread tag end and the wire wraps to jump your thread behind the wire. Then take wraps against the butt end of the wire wraps to secure them horizontally to the hook. Now you can snip off your thread tag end. As you're tying and switching between spools of thread, find the sweet spot on your bobbin's tension adjustment to make sure you can take these wraps without having to pull down too tightly on the thread. Too much tension will cause your thread to wedge in between wire turns and unfurl your wire. Next, we'll form a tapered thread body running from the start of the bend of the hook, past the wire wraps, and ending an eye length or so in front of them. Don't try building up the thread in one place at a time, and make sure to move back and forth over the shank of the hook. Staying in one place will build a wobbly thread base that will be more prone to collapsing. Bring your thread to the bend when you're satisfied with the taper. If you're using natural dubbing, like hare's mask, you may want to apply dubbing wax for this next step. Here I'm using low-tack wax. You can skip this step, but for coarse materials, wax can help keep the dubbing stay neat and consistent. If you're using this kind of wax, dab it against the thread without leaving any large clumps of wax residue. If you're using fur from a whole hare's mask, snip off a small tuft, about a pinky's width, from an area of the mask that has soft underfur, as well as some longer, coarse guard hairs. Places like the actual ears won't have enough underfur, and some other sections may not have those guard hairs, so preen and search for a suitable clump. You can see I really didn't take too much. Less is definitely more when it comes to dubbing. We can always cut off more later if we need it. Notice the variety in our hair clump. There's shorter fluff and long, coarse, dark guard hairs. The combination will give us our desired bugginess. Take a tiny pinch from that cut tuft and dab it against the sticky wax. However much you think you need is probably a little too much. If you're not using wax, you can skip this dabbing step. Once you have most of that hair caught on the thread, start twisting the dubbing between your fingers to form an even noodle with a slight taper starting at the top. If you didn't use wax, you'll twist bits of dubbing directly onto the thread and form the exact same kind of noodle. Start taking wraps around the hook shank, making sure your dubbing is not unraveling from your thread. Take touching wraps, and if necessary, take more than one turn in place to keep the worm body even. For my fly, I only got a few wraps in before I ran out of dubbing, but that's okay. Just keep redubbing to fill up the whole body as many times as you need. If at any point your dubbing starts to unstick, pause and retwist the dubbing, and even undoing prior turns if you need to. Remember, don't rush. If you have too much dubbing left over, then undo a wrap or so and pull off the extra dubbing, and leave a neat dubbing taper on your thread before taking your last wrap. Make sure you're not crowding that eye when you finish. My own dubbed body ends about an eye length behind the eye of the hook. To finish, take a few thread wraps to form a small, neat head, then whip finish, and finally snip off your thread. Check the description for a reference video if you're not sure how to whip finish. Most of my flies have some sort of head cement, and I applied a drop or so with the tip of a safety pin. A needle or a bodkin will work just fine as well. If you get some adhesive in the eye of the hook, clean it out with a needle or even another hook point. Better to do it now than on the water. There you have it. This classic version just seems to catch fish. Maybe it's because it looks like so many different things, or maybe it's the bugginess of the dubbing. Whatever the case, this fly drops down in the water column pretty well with those lead wraps and can be a great way to target fish down in the stream bed. If you'd like, you can brush out the fur a bit with some Velcro or a dubbing brush and that will give you a really buggy worm. Tie up both styles and see which the fish prefer. This next variation is called the sexy waltz, and this particular sexy waltz is tied on a jig hook. This is a must-have if you're a tight line or a Euro nympher. This version of the fly gets down really quick, has a lot of flash, and rides hook point up to reduce snags. The slotted tungsten beadhead is a must for the jig hook, as a regular beadhead won't fit over the steep jig angle. Additionally, tungsten is denser than brass, so it'll sink faster in the water, which is especially helpful if you're fishing fast current. For this version, I'm using synthetic Simi Seal dubbing, but natural dubbing like in the last one will work just fine. Out of habit, you might place your hook onto the vise without first loading on the beadhead. For all beadhead flies, we'll want to feed on the bead before placing the hook in our vise. Place the slotted bead on your palm and find the smaller opening. Feed your hook point through that smaller opening and flip the hook shank side down so the bead doesn't slide off. To get the beadhead fully in place, you may need to wiggle or spin the beadhead 180 degrees so that it clears both the hook bend and the jig angle. Check to make sure the bead is fully seated against the eye of the hook and not caught at the jig bend. Now we can put the hook in our vise. Since we want this fly to sink quickly, we'll also add lead-free wire wraps to this fly. Remove about 5 inches of wire from the spool and place one end inside the bead slot and rest it against the hook shank. This can be a little tricky, so take your time and don't get too frustrated. With the tip of the wire inside the slot, bend the wire and take some wraps around the hook shank. If you have a spare bobbin, some folks like to spool up the wire for tricky applications like this. I'll just go nice and slow without doing that. Once you get a couple turns, the wire should be stable and you can readjust it by squishing it up against the beadhead. Take wraps about halfway down the hook shank, which for me was about 8 or 9 turns. Make sure to compress the wire wraps against the beadhead to confirm it's the right length. Just like the previous fly, cut or tear off excess wire and press down the sharp end into the hook shank. Tie in your thread just behind the wire wraps. I'm using fluorescent orange because I want this fly to be a flashy attractor. Snip off your tag end and take touching wraps back to the start of the bend. Grab a strand of flashabou or flat tinsel. Mine is about 1 millimeter thick. Take one end of the flash and place it against the side of the hook shank closest to you. Then take wraps around the flash and the hook shank, making sure the flash extends into the wire wraps. Take thread turns to secure the flash, making sure to cover it starting from your thread base at the bend. Then, like in our previous fly, take thread wraps back and forth to form a nice tapered ramp onto the wire turns. If your thread is butting up against the back of the wire and the front of the wire is wedged into the beadhead slot, you should have enough leeway to wrap over the wire without fear of those wire turns splaying out. Here I'm using Simi Seal, but if you are using a natural fur, then dub like we did our previous fly. Just like natural fur, Simi Seal blends fibers of varying color, length, texture, and even a little flash. You can use dubbing wax for this synthetic stuff as well, but I'll do without this time. Pinch and pull out a tiny amount of dubbing. I also use my opposite hand to pinch the larger wad of dubbing to make sure I'm pulling out fibers that are oriented in a single direction. Remember, less is more. Twist on the faintest amount of Simi Seal onto your thread. I like to form a minimal base layer first so that more dubbing can stick onto it subsequently. Slowly twist on more dubbing, again trying to keep a taper at the top of the noodle. When your noodle is a couple to 3 inches long, you can start taking wraps. The same principles apply from our previous fly. Don't go too quickly, and make sure the dubbing isn't coming undone on your turns. It's much easier to back off one turn and retwist dubbing than it is to undo several turns. Redub as often as you need until you reach your beadhead. Next, we're going to wind our flash. Whichever way you wound your dubbing, you'll want to go in the opposite direction with your flash. These crisscrossing wraps will make the fly a little bit more durable. Take turns and space out the flash evenly, maybe about 1 millimeter between each wrap. Mine ended up with about 4 full turns. Keep tension on your flash with one hand and take thread wraps with the other, making sure you cinch it down before letting go of the flash. With the flash secure, snip off the tag end and save the rest for your next fly. One strand should be enough for at least 3 or 4 flies. Then stroke any wandering fibers backwards and take a few thread wraps right at the base of the beadhead. We'll form a hotspot collar with this fluorescent thread. And just like before, whip finish, snip the thread, and apply head cement. I like fishing this fly as is, but if you're so inclined, you can brush out the dubbing to be buggier. Our last variation is designed to sink slowly and rise up on the swing to imitate emergers. We're going with a less dense brass head and skipping the jig hook since we don't expect this fly to spend a lot of time at the bottom. I'm using a curved hook for this example, but any hook will work. Just make sure you're sizing the bead heads to the hook size accordingly. Check the description for a link to properly match hooks and bead heads. My thread is Chartreuse to match some peeping Caddis colors, but any color will work. Again, the dubbing should be buggy, be it natural fur or synthetic. Again, we'll start by threading our hook onto the bead head. This time, it's not slotted, but there is still a larger and a smaller opening. Just like before, we're going to slide the hook point in through the smaller opening. If you don't, your bead head will look wonky, like this. And done properly, it'll look like this. Place the beaded hook into your vise. If you're using a curved hook like I am, you can orient it so the hook eye points a little downward and the bead head stays in place. Start taking thread wraps behind the bead head. We're skipping the wire wraps because we want this fly to rise up the water column on the swing. Once your thread is secure, snip off the tag end and continue taking wraps down into the bend of the hook. We're wrapping pretty far into the bend here because the bright color will act as a peeping Caddis hotspot. When you reach the bend, you can reorient your hook so that your thread wraps don't slide around. We don't want to build up too much bulk, so take the wraps slowly and assess if you think the hotspot is the right size. Take touching wraps back towards the start of the bend, making sure your thread isn't building up too much bulk in any one spot. I'll wax again because I'm using natural fur dubbing. Just like before, dab on some wax without leaving behind any clumps. Snip off some fur and dust on small pinches onto your thread. Once it's evenly distributed, you can twist the dubbing with your fingers to form a thin, even noodle with a slight taper at the top. This should all be familiar. Just like our last two versions, take wraps and make sure the dubbing stays neatly on your thread. If it starts to detach from the thread, unwind a wrap or two, retwist the dubbing, and continue. If you need to, readjust your hook so that the shank is more horizontal. I like this body to have a slight taper, and we don't really have the wire wraps for bulk this time. So by the time you work towards the head of the fly, you may want to take extra turns with dubbing to build that thorax section up. Once at the bead head, take a few thread wraps to really cinch down. If your thread is kind of thin, then don't yank too hard. Finally, whip finish, trim the excess thread, and apply a drop of head cement. Just like our last two, this fly is perfectly fishable at this point. However, since I'm imitating a caddis, I want some of those longer tendrils that are characteristic of the pupal stage. I'll brush out the dubbing a bit, and you'll see that it has a swept back look. There you have it, our third fly building on the traditional waltz worm pattern. Try tying and fishing each of these and let me know in the comments which you have the most success with. If you post your own ties on social media, tag me at WestTideFlies. Thanks for watching!